Hey, second graders, it's the last week of school. We can't believe it. So, this is our last. We're going to do 3 days. We did not include the quiz. So, you're just going to have the work in your math book, is all you're going to have to do for this week. Um, we miss you so much. It's just been, I know, crazy and all of those things, but we want you to enjoy this last week with just a few assignments and then enjoy your summer break. So anyway, let's get started. We are on lesson 29, session 1, page 707. We are exploring shapes, okay, to put shapes in halves, thirds, and fourths. So we're going to divide shapes. We're going to look at some different ways to divide than maybe what we've done before. So we're going to look at those things as we go. So let's get started.
Okay, so first we're going to take a look at these different shapes. And we're going to talk about which shapes show halves. So we have a triangle, a square, a rectangle, and a circle. Now what you need to know about halves are that halves show two parts. So it's one shape that you cut in half, and it then makes two parts, okay? So if you were to see something called a fraction, I'm just going to show you that really quick because I think it helps you understand. If you were to see something called a fraction, one whole part cut into halves, it would look like this. It would look like 1/2, right? But this could also, the one could also look like 2 parts over 2 parts, okay? So you know that when you're looking at a shape and it's cut into 2 parts, when you put those 2 parts together, it's still just one shape, right? But to make it a half, you then only have 1/2 like shaded out of the 2 different parts. So let's take a look at the shapes that we have up here. Which shapes are cut into half? So which shapes are cut into just 2 equal parts? What do you think, Mrs. Walker?
So if we look at that triangle, I count 1, 2 pieces. So I would say the triangle is cut into halves. When I look at the square, I see 1, 2 pieces. So the square is cut into halves. When I look at the rectangle, though, I see 1, 2, 3, 4. So that one is cut into fourths, not halves. And then the circle is also 1, 2. So that one is also cut into halves.
Good job.
All right, how do you divide shapes into 2, 3, and 4 equal parts? So if we start with this rectangle, we just learned in the last slide how to divide in half. This person gets half, this person gets half, right? So if we do half, that's pretty easy, right? Half of it is, right, the key to it is it has to be equal parts. So if you look at Mrs. Croft's line, do each of those parts look equal?
My line's not perfectly straight, but let's pretend that it is. You would want to make sure that you cut it exactly in half. Okay, so there's the same amount over here as there is over here. So now I'm going to show you something. I'm going to cut this rectangle into 2 parts. Is that cut in half?
Well, you cut it into 2 parts, but it's not cut in half because if I would fold that, look how much more space the one side has versus the other side. So that doesn't work.
So it has to be equal.
Mhm.
What about 3 equal parts? Well,
Okay.
you wouldn't want to cut it in half for 3 equal parts. You would want to try to figure out where a third would be. So I'd say about here. Oh no, see, that's probably not even right. Go a little farther. About here,
Mhm.
and then I'd cut those into equal parts. It's almost
Yep.
like inches on a ruler. You want them evenly spaced.
Mhm.
You could do it that way. And another thing you have to wrap your brain around is that the lines aren't always going to go the same direction. So
Right.
another way that we could envision this would be to cut it into 3 parts. this direction, right? As long as the as long as the parts are equal and the same. I'm sorry, it's really hard to make a straight line with this, but it looks like about that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But equal. So
Yep.
that would be 3 parts. So the direction of the line can be vertical or horizontal. As long as the parts are the same size and equal, then it works.
Yep.
Another thing is that you would notice that there would be 3, you create 3 shapes inside the one shape, right? 1, 2, 3. So that's how you know that you're cutting them into thirds, because when you count them, there are 3.
Right.
Okay, you want to talk about fourths?
Yep. So if we go fourths, I mean, the easiest way is probably to cut it in half first and then cut it going the long way. So that's probably how I would do it. That's the easiest way. But again, you can cut it any way you want, right? As long as there's 4 pieces. So if we count that 1, 2, 3, 4, does that work? Yes. And if the lines, again, second graders, your lines aren't going to be perfect. We just expect you to try to make them as equal as possible. Okay.
There's lots of different ways. This is another way to cut it in half. Oh, that's a really bad line, but that could work. Well, does that work? Are they equal here and like here and here?
I think it would if it was perfect.
Okay.
Yep. So you're good.
So just what the whole point of this question was to explain to you that when you cut shapes into to 2s and 3s and 4s, if you're cutting them in half, there will be 2 shapes that you cut them into. When you cut them into thirds, there will be 3. When you cut them into 4, there will be 4. So it's very simple, but they have to be equal, okay? Or as close to equal as you can make them.
Yes. So let's look at some model it. So it says shade 1/4 of this square. Now, if you look at this square really quick, do all of our, the inside of our shape, are all of them the same? They're not all the same, okay? So this gets a little bit tricky, but if you notice, there are still 4 parts, okay? If we count, there's still 1, 2, 3, 4 parts. So if it wants us to just shade one of them, okay, that's where we just pick any one and we shade it in. And then it says the whole square is blank fourths. So how many pieces do we have all together? 4. So it's 4 fourths. Now, this is not our recommendation for how you would draw it, okay? But we just want you to show you that it could be drawn this way so you don't get confused later on.
So remember how I showed you earlier that one shape could be divided into 4 different parts, but one shape has 4 parts out of it, so it looks like 4 over 4. Do you see how this says 4 fourths? That's what this means, 4 fourths, and it's saying 1 whole square. Does that make sense? It's kind of, it's a little bit harder math, this part is, but that's where it relates.
Yes.
Okay, let's look at the next slide. It's asking us again to shade 1/4 of this square. Again, we would not draw our fourths like this. We would either choose to draw just the little squares, so we would have a straight line here, or we would choose to draw the horizontal lines and do another one here. That just helps our brain, but for the sake of this, we're going to shade just 1/4 of this square. I'm going to pick this one, right? I can shade any one of these boxes. Do I want to shade more than one though? No. If you look at the whole square, how many fourths are there? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So there are 4 fourths.
Yep. All right, so the next one, it says shade 1/2 of each square. So we're going to just shade a half. We know a half is 2 pieces, okay? So it says each whole square is 2 halves, because if we count 1, 2, we get 2 halves. Half's pretty easy as long as you remember that it's cut right in half. If you're going to share with your brother or sister, you want half and they want half. But is it fair for you to take the big half and them to get the little half? No, that's why it has to be equal.
Think about this as a grilled cheese sandwich. You're going to cut it in half because I believe that the best sandwiches are cut diagonally. I do. but they're equal. Okay. Now we're talking about thirds. So they want us to shade 1/3 of each square. So I'm going to come and I look, there's 3 boxes. I'm going to shade one of the boxes. One. This is not how we would choose to do it, but it's still cut into thirds. I'm going to shade one of them. Each whole square is 1, 2, 3, 3/3, right?
Yep. So look at all the squares divided above. Which parts are bigger, the halves or the thirds? And explain. So if we go back up there and look at the half.
I'm actually just going to do this if it's okay. I'm going to bring us a shape. So here's a rectangle. And if we were to cut this shape in half, hold on one second. I'm going to make 2 of them. Okay. If we were to cut this shape in half, it would look like this, right? Remember, Miss Croft's doing her best. Not the best, but her best. It would look like this, right? So we have 1, 2 parts. If we were to cut this shape into thirds, it would look like this, give or take. Right? 1, 2, 3. So now when you see this, ask yourself, which parts are bigger? Is this part right here, this whole part right here, bigger or smaller than this whole part over here? What do you think?
And I think that the halves are bigger. So I would say the halves are bigger than the thirds.
Think about it this way. This is a sandwich. If you're going to share it with one other person, so you get a piece and your brother gets a piece, or you're going to share it with you get a piece, your brother gets a piece, your sister gets a piece, which of these objects are you going to eat more of, right? Which of these pieces are going to be bigger? It's going to be when you're only sharing with one other person, not 2 other people, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right, so we are going to move on to our green page, and that starts on page 709 and 710. This is what your graphic organizer looks like for the week, and our vocabulary terminology is equal parts. So we're just going to be giving examples of what equal parts are. I used words for the first one. So if I had a granola bar and I cut it in half, if they were equal parts, you'd have 2 equal parts, right? You'd have 1, 2 equal parts because you cut them in half. So you can give examples like that with words. You could say, if I had a granola bar and I cut it into thirds, well, how many would I have, right? How many pieces? You could draw pictures. So for the second example, I drew a picture of a circle and I cut it in half. The third example, I drew a square-ish rectangle and a quadrilateral, and I cut it into fourths, okay? So you could also do that. So I would challenge you to do one more with words and then the other 2 with pictures, okay? You can try to do one with thirds since we've already done a half and fourths, but you can also choose and just use your math knowledge to cut shapes into equal parts.
Yep. And then the back page, it looks like you just shade. So there's just some shading in, and that should be good. So have a great Monday, and we will see you tomorrow.
All right. Bye, friends.